Forever and a Day. Chapter 4. Annalise Meyer. It was a green car, Joe told Michael as they sat in the hospital waiting room in hard, uncomfortable chairs. Joe was looking at his watch. "You mean, this was the same car that you saw before?" Michael asked. He'd started taking notes of what Joe was saying, but had stopped somewhere along the way. "Yeah, it was the same car. And just like before, I couldn't see who was behind the wheel." "I'm sorry," Michael told him in as genuine a tone as he'd ever used. "I should have learned by now. I shouldn't have doubted your instinct." Joe looked down to his shoes and realized that they hadn't been properly shined in about 3 years. It was a strange observation to make at such a serious moment, but that was the thought that came to mind. He shook his head and said to Michael, "It wouldn't have mattered. This doesn't make sense." "These things rarely do." "No, these things always do. Somehow, some way, they always make sense. Sometimes it's not the answer we want, but it always makes sense. Except this time. I think this conversation's above my pay grade. I'm just a cop." Joe smiled, realizing just how absurd he must sound to people when he started rambling on about patterns and inevitability. Michael put his pad down and sat back in his seat, looking around the waiting room. He sounded completely lost as he said, "You told me that this car was following you. Do you have any idea why?" "No, I've never seen it before." "Do you think it had something to do with this Meyer woman?" "I don't know." "It was following you even when she wasn't around though, right?" "Yes." "Did you ever see it before you met her?" "No," Joe answered, but added, "Then again, I never really looked." "You were at the bar, right?" "Yeah." As with so many of their conversations, Joe found himself being interrogated by Michael. Ordinarily, this many questions might annoy him, but he didn't feel pressured or defensive around Michael. He could tell that Detective O'Shea was a good man, just trying to make sense of a senseless world. He would have been able to tell if there were any hidden motives behind the questions. "How did you know that you needed to get back to the store?" Michael asked. There, Joe paused. He normally had an answer that would make sense to himself, even if it didn't make sense to anyone else around him. This time, things were different. He hadn't followed a person. The terror he felt couldn't have come from Annalise or whoever was driving the car, because they were too far away, and Annalise had no idea what was about to happen. The terror wasn't his own. He would have been able to tell if it was someone else, but there was no other person. He must have run a mile from the bar to the store, and he would have noticed if anyone else was moving with him. Even more than that, this terror wasn't a normal emotion. It felt different. It was like a bolt of lightning shooting down from the heavens and striking him right in the chest. He had dozens of questions about the hows and whys of that night, but none of them could be answered while sitting there with Michael. So when he was asked how he knew to get back to the store, he just looked at O'Shea and told him, "I honestly have no idea." "So we have a green, blue, or possibly black Ford a couple of years old," Michael sighed. "No idea who was driving it, no clue what led you to the bookstore. We don't know if she was the target or you. I have to say, it's not a whole lot to work with." "Did you ever get in touch with the other station about her sister?" Joe asked. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigarette case. He opened it to get a cigarette, but found it empty. Slipping it back into his pocket, he looked to Joe as if to ask if he could get a smoke from him. Joe checked his pockets for his own case, but couldn't find it. He said, "I must have left it at the bar." Michael shrugged off the idea of a cigarette and answered Joe's question. "I called around and got in touch with a couple of guys who know who she is. They say she's been in there once or twice a month for a year or so." "You don't sound like they ever found anything." "I'm not even sure they looked very hard. One of them told me that they checked out the sister's apartment. One of the neighbors said that the sisters were always fighting about something or another. There was never any sign of a struggle. No body, no ransom." "Why wouldn't they investigate?" Michael shrugged and said, "Grown adults are allowed to disappear. Turns out this girl's boyfriend left town around the same time. Someone they talked to says that he got married and moved out of state." "So that's it? You think the girl just got married and left town?" Michael shrugged. Joe shook his head, looking back to his dull, scratched-up shoes as he said, "That doesn't explain why someone would want to run her down with a car. Maybe the car wasn't about her. Maybe it was a message for you." "Like what?" "I don't know, but I'd watch my back for the next few days if I were you. Keep an eye out for anyone suspicious. Let me know if you see anything that doesn't look right. Have you seen this city lately? Does any of it look right to you?" "You have a point," Michael nodded, standing up and putting his pad and pencil into his pocket. "Just let me know if anyone tries to kill you. You'll be the first to know, assuming they fail." Joe smiled. "And even if they don't." Michael shook his head disapprovingly. "I'm going to go find some cigarettes. Give me a call if you start seeing puzzle pieces or whatever it is that you see." Michael walked off before Joe could think of a response. Once he was gone, Joe was alone in the waiting room. He hadn't even noticed the other people there before, but now they were all that he could see. He hated hospitals. The streets were depressing enough for him, but inside of hospitals, people were rarely in a good mood. There was physical pain from the sick or injured. There was emotional pain from their families. The nurses were stressed. The doctors were worn down. If he kept his mind busy, he could try to ignore all of the people under that roof. But when he was alone, it was hard not to notice them. He closed his eyes and pushed aside everything that wasn't him. He couldn't afford to be weighed down by the pain of everyone else. He needed to remain sharp. It had been hours since Annalise was run down in the street. Hours since the police had swarmed and the ambulance rushed her into the hospital. Hours since he had heard anything about her. For all he knew, she could be dead. He stood and walked to the reception desk, where there were a few people in line before him. He waited patiently as the desk clerk answered their questions and gave them paperwork to fill out. It seemed like time had stopped the moment he walked into the hospital. The line was taking forever to move. The people in the waiting room sat, talking quietly amongst themselves, waiting for some news of their loved ones or to be called in to see a doctor, but none of them ever seemed to go anywhere. Hours passed and the place only got more crowded. Finally, he could approach the desk, and the clerk behind it looked up at him without any hint of a smile on her face. She was tired and frustrated. "Hi," he said to her with a smile on his face. "I was wondering about a patient that was brought in here a little while ago. Her name is Annalise Meyer. She was hit by a car." "Are you family?" the clerk asked. "No, I'm sort of a friend." "Well, I can't divulge any patient information to sort of friends." "Could you tell me whether or not she is alive?" "I'm sorry, sir. The best thing for you to do right now is wait." "I've been waiting." "Then I'll skip the tutorial. Next in line, please." Joe walked away from the desk, feeling no better than he had when he approached it. He wanted to argue with the woman, but there didn't seem to be a point. In the mood she was in, arguing would only make it harder to get anything out of her. He paced across the floor of the waiting room, looking back to the chair that he had once been sitting in and finding it already taken by another person, just joining the crowd in purgatory. He couldn't go back to waiting. He needed to move. He needed to do something productive. As he looked back to the clerk, he focused on her. He allowed her emotions to bubble to the top of the crowd. She was tired, which made it more difficult to get a read on her than if she was fully awake. But he could feel the annoyance inside of her each time someone approached her desk. They always asked the same questions, ultimately just trying to get some idea of when they would be able to leave that place. But she would never be able to leave. Each day she would have to go back there, day after day, dealing with the same questions over and over again. Most of this was just theory, of course. He could read her emotions, but he had no clue what she was thinking. For all he knew, she could have been upset with her husband. Either way, she was annoyed. He happened to glance down at her desk and noticed a white porcelain coffee cup sitting beside her. It was empty and clean, as though it hadn't been used at all. Behind her, he could see a janitor's mop and bucket sitting next to a wall. He looked back to the clerk and asked, "Do you happen to have any coffee around here?" The level of annoyance within her jumped as she looked up at him and said, "Cafeteria." She looked away from him and went back to her work. He decided to press matters, asking, "Is it any good, the coffee?" When she heard the question, she was undoubtedly annoyed with him, But there was something else beneath that annoyance, just the slightest hint of want that told him that he was on the right path. She didn't answer his question out loud, but he didn't need her to. She'd answered it just fine, without saying a word. It was late. The bar was closing, and Mary found herself standing in the alley, looking down at the cigarette case that she was holding in her hand. She had been there when Norma bought the case as a Christmas present for Joe, at the Sears Roebuck down on Fordham Road. She could practically hear Norma's voice in her head, trying to pick between two cases and asking Mary's opinion on which one he would like best. It seemed so simple at the time. It was something that she should have forgotten and never thought of again, but somehow that night had been etched into her memory. December 22nd, 1933. Mary remembered because a friend was coming home from an out-of-state college the next morning, and Mary was obsessed with the idea of going away for school. All she would talk about was how exciting it sounded to get away from everything familiar and to be alone in a strange place. Norma had asked her if she was just desperate to get away from her family. Mary answered with a resounding yes. The thought of that conversation made her want to cry as she stood in the dark alley. She was in the city where she had lived most of her life, yet she was just as alone as she had always dreamed of being. Suddenly, home was scary to her. She couldn't help but wonder how she could have ever been such a foolish, naive girl. She began to feel cold as she held on to that cigarette case, considering whether to bring it to the bookstore right then or if she should wait until morning. She was worried about Joe. He hadn't come back to the bar after running out, and to leave behind the cigarette case must have meant that something was wrong. Everything was starting to feel wrong to her. She had been watching Joe, and she could see something in his eyes beginning to change. She didn't like it. She had lost all of her blood relatives, and she couldn't afford to lose the one last piece of family that she could claim to have. Mary was determined to help him, just as he had always helped her. The only problem was, she didn't know how. "It's late, Miss Daniels," came a voice from the end of the alley. It was a man, but his face was hidden by shadows. "A girl like you shouldn't be wandering around the streets alone." "I have the drunks to protect me," she replied, in as flat and unaffected a tone as he had used. He put a cigarette into his mouth and lit a match. As he lit the cigarette, she saw his face. Upon realizing that she was talking to Roy Mitchell, Mary couldn't help but wish that he had been a mugger. "Allow me to walk you home?" Roy asked her. "Then you'd know where I live." "You are in the directory." "I never assumed that you could read." "I am a writer." Touché. She hadn't thought that insult through as much as she probably should have. "It's late, Mr. Mitchell. I really don't have a desire to spend the night here, matching wits with you." "I wouldn't say that we were matching anything. I clearly had the upper hand." "A pleasant change of pace for someone so underhanded." Roy smirked and nodded to her. "And the lady takes the lead." "Good night, Mr. Mitchell," she told him as she walked past him onto the sidewalk. Unfortunately, he kept pace with her. She tried her best to ignore him, hoping that he would get the message and leave her alone, but he never did. He just kept walking beside her, silently at first, but then he said, "Aren't you wondering why I came to see you?" "Not in the least." "There was a car accident tonight. A real mess. Someone even got sent to the hospital over it." Mary stopped walking. Suddenly, the cigarette case in her hand felt like it weighed 50 pounds. "Happened right outside that bookstore of yours, too," Roy went on. Her heart skipped a beat. Her head was beginning to spin. This is it, she thought. Alone. Roy looked at her with a smile on his face and a sparkle in his eye. He was delighting in this moment. Finally, he said, "Don't worry that pretty little head of yours. Joe's fine. Quite a coincidence, though, don't you think?" "He's all right. He wasn't hurt?" "Not a scratch on him. The poor dame who was hit, on the other hand. My source tells me that she knocked her head pretty hard and broke a rib. I suppose it could have been worse, though, if the car had been going any faster." "Why are you telling me this? Why are you even here?" Mary asked, genuinely puzzled. "I thought we might go out sometime." Mary stopped walking. She looked him dead in the eyes and tried to figure out whether or not he was joking. For a moment, she expected him to burst out into laughter. But he didn't, so she did it for him. He didn't seem to find the situation as funny as she did. "Is this how you approach all the women?" she asked him. In dark alleys, with stories that lead them to believe that their only living family member is dead? Not all women, he replied, with a straight face and a serious tone. She kept her eyes on his and stood tall as she said, I want you to understand me very clearly. I do not now, nor will I ever wish to go out with you. I do not like you. I do not want you hounding me or my brother-in-law. I simply want you gone. Now, if you will excuse me, I wish to walk without you now. She began to walk down the sidewalk, leaving Roy behind without looking back to make sure that he was staying put. Unfortunately for him, he didn't seem to get the message. He must have been following her because of what she heard next. The lady said that she didn't want you following her, came the voice of another man. Mary turned around. As she did, she noticed two men standing by one of the cars which were parked next to the sidewalk. She hadn't seen them there before, but they were the men from the bar, the loud one and his quiet sailor friend. The loud one was standing by the driver's side door, keeping an eye on Roy. The one in the peacoat was standing by the passenger side closest to the sidewalk. He looked over to Mary with worry in his eyes. He didn't seem to like where this was going. His friend, on the other hand, was as bold as ever as he yelled at Roy, So I suggest you stop walking and leave her in peace. Roy looked over at the man and put up a hand, saying, I suggest you mind your own business. Roy turned toward Mary and began to walk. He hadn't taken 3 steps toward her before the quiet man in the peacoat was grabbing him by the collar and holding him against the nearest wall. The quiet man looked toward Mary, and in as shaky a voice as he always seemed to use with her, he said, You have a nice night, ma'am. Roy tried to push himself free, but the man in the peacoat held him against the wall, while his friend remained by the car and said, I was planning on doing that too. I just didn't have time. And my wrist has been acting up too, so... Mary wasn't quite sure how to respond, so instead of saying anything at all, she simply smiled her thanks to the men and began to walk away. She never looked back to see what happened to Roy. Joe placed a cup of coffee on the desk in front of the clerk as she dealt with more people asking the same questions as before. She seemed surprised to see it at first, and perhaps a little suspicious of Joe for putting it there. You look like you could use this, he told her, walking back to the waiting room. The desk clerk took the coffee and tasted it. She never thanked Joe for his thoughtfulness, but then he never expected her to. The mood in the room changed just slightly after that. She wasn't annoyed with the people who just wanted answers about their friends and loved ones. She wasn't doing a song and dance routine for them, but the edge of her personality was rounded just enough to make the night more tolerable for everyone involved. Next in line, she shouted behind Joe, and business went on as always. He stood in the waiting room looking at all of the people, getting a sense for the frustration and general uselessness that each of them felt. That room was designed for one purpose, to wait. To do nothing but sit and stare at the wall, waiting for someone else to take action and do something. Joe wasn't in the mood to wait. Even if Annalise were dead, they might not tell him. He could be waiting there all night and never hear a thing. So he decided not to wait. He wasn't going to sit down and pass the time counting tiles on the floor. He turned around and walked out of the waiting room through the hospital, trying to come up with a plan. The only trouble was he didn't know where to begin. Why was Annalise waiting for him outside of his bookstore? Was it just to hound him some more? Was it something else? Why was that car following him? Who was driving? Why would they run Annalise down instead of waiting for him to be in the crosswalk? Had they even done it on purpose, or was it all an unfortunate accident? He could see the pieces of the puzzle spread out in front of him, but none of them seemed to fit together. He needed to find a starting point and examine the situation from there. But first things first, he needed to get himself cleaned up. It had been a long night, and sitting in the hospital made him feel as though he was covered in disease. By the time he left the hospital, Joe knew where he was going, at least for the time being. He walked out the front door and waved down a taxi. Once inside, he told the driver to take him home. As he sat in the back of the taxi, Joe watched the world rush past him in a blur. The people that he passed were there and gone in seconds, with no time for him to get a feel for them. The only person he could feel in that car was the driver, and he wasn't a man of great emotion. When he arrived at his apartment, Joe climbed the stairs, feeling more and more tired with each step. He showered and changed his clothes, but the longer he remained awake, the more the past couple of days caught up with him. He hadn't had a proper night's sleep in days. He decided to sit on the couch just to catch his breath for a few moments before heading out the door. He sat, and his eyelids grew heavy. He leaned his head on a nearby pillow, and within a minute, he was asleep. When Joe opened his eyes, the sun was shining brightly outside. The world was awake, and it had been going on without him. When he checked his watch and saw that it was nearly 10 o'clock, he wanted to smack himself. There was too much to do, and he couldn't afford to waste time sleeping. He got to his feet and hurried out the door. He needed to get to the bookstore and open it. He needed to check on Annalise at the hospital. Joe would have liked nothing more than to go back to his quiet existence, but things had changed. Now he needed to find out what was going on. If he didn't, who knew what would happen next, or who would be hurt? That fear was what pushed him forward as he hurried toward his store. He ignored all of the other people on the street and focused his attention squarely on the matter at hand. As he neared the bookstore, he could see Mary waiting outside, and his mind immediately went to Annalise, who had been waiting in that same spot the night before. Joe's eyes moved toward the street, looking for that car and praying that he wouldn't find it waiting to take down its next victim. Mary didn't see him coming. She was standing in front of the store reading a magazine, completely oblivious to the world around her. Anything could happen. Anyone could walk up to her and stick a knife in her gut, and how could anyone stop it from happening? Joe didn't even know what the person behind the wheel of that car looked like. It could have been anyone on the street. He could have been walking right next to him, and he wouldn't have known until it was too late. As soon as he was in shouting distance, Joe called out to her, "Mary!" She didn't hear him. The crowd was too thick, and she was caught up in her magazine. "Mary!" he called again, and this time she did look up at him. She closed her magazine and stood there, waiting for him to get close enough to hold a conversation. As soon as he was near, she said, "I've been waiting here all morning." "I'm late, I'm sorry," he replied, leading her through the door and into the store. She seemed curious as to why he was pushing her inside when it was a perfectly nice day out, but she didn't ask him. Instead, she said, "I opened the store for you. We've had 3 customers, 2 bought books, and the other one stared at me as though I could read his thoughts." "Yeah, he comes in every so often," Joe told her. "Does he ever say anything?" "I'm not sure he knows how." "Well, he gave me the creeps," Mary said, putting the magazine back on its rack and walking to the counter. "So, I just looked at him like I could read his thoughts, every last one of them. He took off running like a scared rabbit." Joe didn't slow down once he entered the store, and he wasn't listening to Mary. He looked around, trying to figure out what to do next. He needed to find information, but he needed a starting point. Nothing was coming immediately to mind. Mary went to her purse behind the counter and pulled out his cigarette case. She handed it to him and said, "You forgot this when you ran out last night." He took the case and slipped it into his pocket. She went on to say, "I hear you had an eventful night. Someone got run down in the street?" He looked at her, trying to figure out how in the world she could have known what happened. Who told her? Those questions must have been written all over his face because she leaned up against the counter and told him, "I saw that reporter last night. He told me all about the woman with the broken rib." "Broken rib?" Joe asked, surprised to find Mary with more information than he'd been able to get at the hospital. "Did he say anything else? Is she okay?" Mary shrugged. "I think he said that she hit her head, but he didn't mention anyone dying, so I guess she'll live." "Why? Who is she?" "She's a woman who came to me for help." "And you turned her down, I assume?" "Of course," Joe nodded, walking behind the counter and taking a seat on his stool. "But there was this car that was following me all day." "Following you? Why?" "I don't know why, but that was the car that hit the woman." "So now you feel guilty. Now you need to find answers." It was amazing how predictable Joe was. Even when he found himself falling into situations that he never could have expected, the people around him never seemed surprised. "What'd she want your help with?" Mary asked. "Her sister's missing. The cops think that she got married and took off, but this woman doesn't buy it." "I don't either. People don't usually get run over because their sister eloped." "We don't know that the car was meant for her." "I think the bumper would say otherwise." "It might have been a message. Maybe someone doesn't like the thought of me poking around." "Poking around what? You wouldn't even be involved if they hadn't run your lady friend over. She's not my lady friend. I'm just saying, maybe it's not that they want you out of the picture. Maybe they want you in the picture. Why? Mary shrugged. Of course, he couldn't expect her to have any answers. She was as clueless as he was. Maybe they just want to see what you're capable of, same as everyone else, she suggested. Either way, I'd be careful. Aren't I always? Sure, when you're not jumping through windows. He smiled, but he didn't say anything in response. He still needed to figure out what he wanted to do about any of this. Even if he wanted to try to find answers, he didn't know where to look. Mary took a deep breath and thought for a moment. She then said, Well, I suppose you could start by figuring out who this woman is. For all you know, she set this whole thing up just to get you involved. She got herself run over. She'll live, won't she? According to your reporter friend. He's not my friend. I had to have a sailor hold him down just so I could get away from him, she said, before smiling and putting a hand over her mouth. It was the funniest thing I've seen this year. By the time she finished that sentence, Joe was pulling out the Manhattan telephone directory and flipping through the pages. Mary leaned over the counter, reading the listings upside down as he went. How do you know she's from Manhattan? Mary asked. She gave me her card. It had her phone number on it. Why are you looking her up if you have her card? Because I gave it to Michael O'Shea, he said. Listen, Mary, I need a favor. You want me to watch the store while you go solving crimes like Sherlock Holmes. Do you mind? Mary took a deep breath and looked at her nails as though she might have something better to do with her time. Eventually, she shrugged and said, I suppose I should earn my half of the profits from this place at some point. You're a doll. Just remember, I have to work tonight. I'm not on the lunch shift anymore. Oh? Yeah, turns out there's no lunch shift anymore. I guess Rummy got tired of making grilled cheese and tomato soup. He never was good at it. Joe ripped a page from the directory and folded it. As he stuffed it into his pocket, he said, If anyone calls for me, you'll take a message, right? I've heard tell of the practice. I suppose it's worth a shot, Mary said, scratching her head. Remind me how to use a pencil again, would you? Joe didn't have time to appreciate her sense of humor. The clock was ticking. The question was, what was it counting down to? Crossing over into Manhattan was like entering a new world for Joe. He didn't do it often, but when he did, he never ceased to be amazed by the sights and sounds. It might have seemed silly to anyone else, since the trek was a short one, but to him, they felt like they were worlds apart. The buildings were bigger on Manhattan's side of the bridge, and the personalities were as well. Joe had grown up in a small Pennsylvania town, away from honking horns and police sirens at all hours of the night. His youth was quiet, and he remembered the people as being pleasant, though they often hid their true feelings behind a smile. He moved to the city after he was married, and it smacked him right in the face. The streets were crowded and smelled strange. He couldn't walk down the street without feeling as though he was covered in dirt, even if it was all in his head. And the people, all crammed into such a small area, wore away at him. They weren't always sad or angry, but the constant waves of conflicting emotions nearly drove Joe insane. In fact, some might argue that it had driven him insane. He was drawn to the worst of it, like a moth to a flame, and he was pulled deeper and deeper into that pit, losing sight of himself and drowning in a sea of emotions that didn't belong to him. That was the Bronx. Manhattan was something else entirely. It was overwhelming for him to look at. The streets were like gigantic caves, surrounding him in concrete, steel, and glass for as far as the eye could see on every side, and reaching into the heavens above him. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The buildings were nothing short of art. Manhattan, more than any other place he had ever seen, had a spirit of its own. At times, he could swear that he could feel the emotion of the place more than the people who lived there. When he had ventured over the bridge during those first years in the city, some part of Joe always worried that he would never be able to find his way out, or that he would never want to leave. The feeling of that place was as alluring to him as the darkest emotions of the Bronx, sucking him in ever deeper and shutting out everything else. That draw scared him enough to make him stay away. But things had changed. He knew how to control what he let in now. He knew how to separate himself from everything else, and he kept reminding himself of this fact as he walked through those streets, growing ever closer to Annalise Meyer's apartment building. He wasn't sure what he expected to find when he reached her building. He couldn't get into her apartment to poke around. He just wanted to get a feel of what her world was like. The streets that she walked, the people that she spent her life with, whether she knew them or not. When he reached her address, he looked up at her building and sighed. It must have been 3 times the height of his own building. Undoubtedly, she lived in a fancy apartment with expensive furniture, judging by her personal style and attitude. The door to the building opened and 3 little children ran out, 2 little boys and a girl, followed by their mother. She was trying to hold the door open as she carried a box in her arms and yelled at the kids to slow down and wait for her. Joe rushed up the stairs and held the door for her. "Thank you so much," she said to him. "You'd think that one of my darling children would be able to help me." "It's no trouble," Joe responded with a smile. Once she was through the door, she began to walk down the front steps, yelling at her kids, "Get back here and wait for me." "Do you want help with that box?" Joe offered, walking down a few of the stairs without following the woman any farther. He didn't want to look like a mugger. "Thanks, but I have to take this thing 15 blocks, and asking for that much kindness from a stranger would be too much." "Are you sure? I'd be happy to help." "No, it'll be good for me, assuming I live to tell the tale," she smiled. "Have a nice day." The woman walked off, trying to gather her herd. She wasn't anything like Annalise Meyer, as far as Joe could tell. No sense of entitlement, no anger. She was a pleasant woman in a reasonably good mood considering her situation. These were a different type of people than he was used to. Less immigrants, and more established residents with jobs and food to spare. The worry was still there, but there were more ingredients in their mix, taking the edge off. He took a seat on the front steps of Annalise's apartment building and looked around the street, with all those faces and stores, soaking it all in while trying his best not to look too far down the street so that he couldn't see how far those buildings extended. Whenever he allowed the scale to sink in, he began to feel closed in. There was a Walgreens down on the corner, with a dark blue awning over the large windows, a hat shop next to that, a shoe store, a restaurant. Joe looked from storefront to storefront for as far as he could see, picturing Annalise living her life in this place. He turned in the other direction and saw a church on the next block. Its Gothic design stood out amongst the rest of the buildings. Its arches and steeples didn't rise nearly as high as some of the other buildings around it, but its design drew the eye in, demanding attention and respect. Joe wasn't a churchgoer. He'd never been the type to get dressed up on Sunday morning and sit in the pews. He had formed a personal relationship with God, asking questions and oftentimes finding answers sprinkled across his path. But he hadn't even stepped foot inside a church since he attended his last funeral. And yet, he couldn't take his eyes off of that building. If Annalise lived in this neighborhood, maybe she attended services there. Priests knew their flock. At least that was the theory that Joe was working with as he began to walk toward the church. Walking inside the church was as intimidating as walking amongst the skyscrapers outside. The walls inside the church seemed just as tall as the biggest building in town. They were dark, with intricate carvings. Stained glass windows lit the room in red and yellow light. Candles burned, and Joe could only assume that there was some sort of incense as well, because the place smelled like his grandmother's house. Each step he took echoed through the church, and all the way to the crucifix which hung over the altar. Joe couldn't take his eyes off of the crucifix as he walked deeper and deeper into the church. Its figure of Jesus, eyes just barely open, seeming to stare directly at him. There were only a few other people in the church, sitting silently in the pews, praying or simply thinking. The man sitting the closest to the front of the church was stone-faced, but he was in pain. If Joe had to guess, he would say that the man had lost someone close to him. The pain of that loss was strong, and the man hadn't yet learned to cope with his loss. Joe was tempted to sit with the man and talk with him. He might be able to take some of the sharpness away from that pain, but he chose not to. It wasn't his place to feel that loss, nor to dull its edge. "Can I help you?" came the voice of a man from behind Joe. Joe turned to see the man and found himself face to face with a priest, standing patiently with a folded chessboard in his hands. The priest was an older man, with thinning white hair and gray eyes. He had a peaceful look about him, but there was a hidden irritation behind that look. I'm not Catholic, Joe told the priest, though he didn't know why. The priest smiled. I won't hold it against you, but I have to wonder why you're here. There it was again. Behind that smile, the priest was upset, annoyed. Joe returned the smile and said, Annalise Meyer, do you know her? I do. So she comes here. The priest avoided answering that question. Instead, he asked, I'm sorry, who are you? A friend. The priest looked down to the floor and then to Joe's worn shoes. Joe suddenly felt out of place, standing in the church of a well-to-do neighborhood. The priest was suspicious, concerned. He asked, Where from? She came to me, asking for my help in finding her sister, Joe told him, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the picture of Annalise's sister. He showed it to the priest. The priest looked it over and then looked back to Joe with a nod. Happier times. Were they? Joe asked. I hear that the sisters didn't get along too well. Who told you that? A friend of mine down at the police station. The priest took a seat in one of the nearby pews and urged Joe to sit as well. He took a seat just in front of the priest. Annie loved her sister. She worried about her. Why? Leah was impulsive. She was spirited, the priest told Joe, looking toward the crucifix but seeming to see the past instead as he spoke. I didn't see much of Leah. Just Easter and Christmas, like so many of the people in the city. Do you believe what the police say? That she got married and ran off. The priest bobbed his head, telling Joe that he wasn't entirely sure, but it wasn't out of the question. What about Annalise? Joe asked. What about her? What sort of person is she? The priest considered his words for a moment before saying, She was a kind, caring, gentle soul. She would do anything for her family. She helped others. As the priest spoke, Joe noticed a strange pattern in the way he spoke of Annalise. He asked, Why are you talking about her in the past tense? Because I haven't seen Annie Meyer in this church since her sister disappeared, the priest replied. I worry that her need for answers is consuming her. The priest didn't have anything more to say to Joe on the subject of the Meyer sisters. He began to stand up and said, If you'll excuse me. He carried his chessboard as he began to walk away. Before he could get very far, Joe said to him, You don't like losing, do you? The priest turned around and looked at Joe with questioning eyes. He was unprepared for the comment. Your chessboard. The priest looked down at his board and then back to Joe, assuming that something about his attitude had betrayed the fact that he'd lost. I've never been very good at the game, the priest told him. But that doesn't mean that I stopped trying. The priest walked off, leaving Joe to consider his next move. When he had decided to visit Annalise's neighborhood, he had hoped to find the next piece of the puzzle, but he wasn't sure that he had. What he'd found was that the brash, insistent woman that had come into his store had good reason to be angry. Her sister was gone, and nobody would listen to her. Nobody would believe that Leah was truly in danger, all because of some vague notion that they had about the woman. The priest had painted a picture of Annalise in Joe's head. That picture was of a good person, torn down by the world. She believed that her sister was in danger, but she held out hope that Leah would be found. She begged others for help, but was denied at every turn. The fact was that she had been run down by a mysterious car that Joe had seen following him. Whether that car was meant for her, or if her being hit was meant as a sign for him, he didn't know. But the more time that passed, the more he found himself believing her. She needed help to find her sister, and maybe the date of her sister's disappearance was God's way of getting him involved. He looked at his watch. She had to be awake by now. If he hurried, he could catch the next trolley back to the Bronx and begin finding real answers. Mary sat in the bookstore all day, flipping through magazines and books. She had spent her entire childhood watching her father do the same thing. The difference was, he seemed to enjoy it. To her, the idea of sitting behind the counter of that store for the day, watching the door, waiting for someone to come in and browse around, was painful. The thought of doing it every day for the rest of her life was unbearable. She kept her eye on the clock. The store was nowhere near ready to close. Each second seemed to take a minute to pass, each minute an hour. Nobody had been in to shop for hours. She didn't know how Joe did it. She didn't understand how the store stayed open, though she was beginning to understand why her monthly cut of the profits was so small. Mary dropped her head to the counter and rested it there, ready to fall asleep, but fighting the urge. She moaned and kicked the back of the counter. When she lifted her head, she looked toward the door. She wasn't surprised to find that nobody was coming through it. She was surprised, however, when she saw a familiar face walk past the window. It was the sailor from the bar, the man in the peacoat. He was walking slowly enough for Mary to spot him, but quickly enough that if she didn't act fast, her only chance for human interaction might be lost. She raced around the counter to the door and out to the sidewalk. Since her father had always taught her not to go more than a step or two away from the door, lest someone steal the merchandise, Mary stood there and yelled, "Hey!" The sailor kept walking as though he didn't hear her, or he didn't think that she could be talking to him. "Hey, sailor!" she yelled, before realizing that she sounded just like one of those ladies of the night that she saw in the movies. She looked around the street to see if anyone was looking at her. The sailor turned around and saw her. He smiled, but didn't immediately move toward her. "I'm sort of tied to this store. Would you mind walking over here?" Mary asked. He looked around, as though he still wasn't sure that she was talking to him. Then he walked toward her, keeping a confused look in his eyes. Once he was standing near her, he said, "I wasn't following you. My grandmother lives just up the street." Mary couldn't help but laugh, though she felt horrible about it. He seemed so nice, and here she was laughing in his face. "I'm sorry," she said, raising her hands and pulling herself together. "I'm not laughing at you, I'm laughing with you. It's just that you're not laughing, so it seems an awful lot like I'm laughing at you." "That's okay, I get it a lot." "I wanted to thank you for what you did." As she spoke to him, she looked back toward the store, where a customer had chosen that moment of all moments to walk in. She winced as she turned back to the sailor and asked, "Would you mind coming inside, just for a moment?" He nodded and stuck his hands in his pocket as they walked back to the store. The entire day, she hadn't had to deal with customers. She'd spent all that time trying to find some way of not going crazy, and the moment she found someone interesting to talk to, she had to go back to work. It was just her luck. The customer in the store was an older woman, with gray hair and glasses sitting on the tip of her nose as she looked over the titles on the shelves. She ran her finger along each book, shaking her head and saying, "No, no, no," over and over again. Mary walked behind the counter and took a seat. The sailor followed her, but stood awkwardly in front of the counter, looking at the shelves behind her where they kept some of the more expensive editions. "My name is Mary," she told him, trying to get his attention back to her. "I probably should have introduced myself last night, but with all of the commotion, I didn't have the chance." She held out her hand for him to shake. He took it and said, "It's nice to meet you. Formally, I mean. What's your name?" "Oh," he said with a cringe toward his own forgetfulness. Sam Dandridge." "I have an uncle named Sam," she smiled. "And that's not a joke about the government. I've never met him, though." No, the woman browsing the shelves mumbled once again. Then, with an "ah," she picked a book off of the shelf. Sam glanced back toward the woman and then to Mary. He didn't seem to know what to say to her. "Do you work out of Brooklyn?" she asked, hoping to strike up a conversation, though this was just about the extent of her knowledge in regards to the Navy. "What?" "Oh, no," he replied. "I'm afraid that my friend was bending the truth a little bit when he said that I'm in the Navy. I was discharged a while back." "Well, it's still impressive that you served at all. Where do you work now?" He looked down at the ground and then toward the woman who was browsing in the shelves as he thought about his answer. He then told Mary, "I work here and there, wherever I can find work. Right now I have a job at my cousin's office. He's a lawyer in one of those big firms." "Are you a lawyer too?" "No. I'm actually just delivering the mail. Sorting and delivering it." He seemed ashamed, as though the entire discussion about what he did was a raw nerve and she was walking all over it without meaning to. As he once again looked down to the ground, Mary tried to think of some way of making him feel better. Smiling, she said, "Some of the best people I know are mail carriers. My brother-in-law was one, and a lot of his friends." Mary looked toward the woman who was browsing the shelves. She now had an armful of books that she was carrying around the store, and took the glasses off of her nose as she turned toward the counter. "Can I help you find anything?" Mary asked her. The woman walked to the counter and put the books down, saying, "This will be all for now, thank you." This had to be the largest sale that Mary had seen in that store since she was a teenager, but she tried to act as though it wasn't unusual at all as she checked the woman out and took the woman's money. The whole time she was taking care of this customer, Mary's mind was on Sam. He was awkwardly looking around the store, as though he was trying to figure out a good way of getting out of there, and she felt horrible about it. She could have kicked herself for making him talk about an uncomfortable subject, even if she didn't know that it was uncomfortable when she brought it up. The woman took her books and walked out of the store, and Mary looked back to Sam with a smile, trying to make him feel better. He forced a smile in return, but said, "I really should be going." Mary nodded, not wanting to hold him against his will. As he started to walk out the door, she couldn't help but think that she had just taken this perfectly nice man's day and ruined it. She closed her eyes and said, "I'm broke. I don't have a penny, and I'm trying to live in the same apartment where my parents raised me, but the truth is that I simply can't afford it. I've sold everything they own, and now I go home and it's just an empty shell of the home that I used to have. My sister's dead. My niece—" Mary couldn't even finish saying that one, so she moved on. "I say dumb things, and I make a lot of mistakes, and if I made you uncomfortable, I'm sorry. But now you know the most uncomfortable subjects for me to talk about, so I'm hoping that we can be even." Sam stopped walking and turned around, looking at her as though she was completely nuts. She smiled awkwardly and looked around the store. After a moment, she asked, "So, I was wondering if you wanted to stay and talk for a while. Nobody's been in here all day, and I'm desperate for a little company." Sam took one hand out of his pocket and rubbed his chin as he stepped toward her. Once he was standing right in front of the counter, he pulled his other hand from its pocket and placed a stack of playing cards down on the counter. "Do you know how to play poker?" he asked her. She shook her head and asked, "War?" He smiled at her and began to shuffle the cards. As he did, he said, "I haven't played since I was a little kid, but I guess it's worth a shot." "Loser pays for dinner?" she asked, though she felt foolish as soon as she said it. She wasn't one to go around asking boys on dates. Her mother would have absolutely died if she were still alive. "No," Sam responded, shaking his head. Mary felt even stupider after being rejected, but then Sam added, "You're broke, and my mother would send me to fetch a switch if I let a girl pay for dinner. So I'll be paying, just as long as you don't mind a cheap dinner." She shook her head. She didn't mind at all. Joe walked into the hospital just after 4 in the afternoon. It had taken him longer than he would have preferred to get down to Manhattan and back. And what did he have to show for that trip? Well, he knew that his first impression of Annalise wasn't entirely accurate. She was a person who had suffered a great loss, and he could sympathize with that. She was desperate for answers, and he could sympathize with that as well. Sometimes it seemed like his entire life was spent looking for answers to questions he didn't even know to ask. He believed her. Even if the police didn't think that her sister was in danger, Joe believed that there was a reason for her finding him. There was a reason why Leah had gone missing on the date that she had. There was a reason why Joe was supposed to look into this situation. For the first time in a long time, Joe felt like he was moving in the right direction. He wasn't sitting in the dark with the unlucky people. He wasn't randomly following a hunch into the unknown, hoping to happen upon success. He was actively seeking something out. He was looking for the puzzle pieces rather than waiting for them to fall into his lap. It felt good. As he walked into the waiting area, Joe approached the desk clerk. It was a different woman than before. This one was younger and had a less harsh look about her. She was filling out paperwork as he walked up to her desk, and she looked up at him when he said, "Hello." There wasn't as much annoyance in this clerk. She wasn't feeling much of anything as far as he could tell. She was going about her normal routine without much thought or care. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I was wondering if I could see Annalise Meyer. She was brought in last night after being hit by a car." "I remember," the clerk told him, looking through another stack of papers. She flipped through paper after paper as Joe watched. He caught a glimpse of names and scribblings of injuries and illnesses. So many people suffered within the walls of the hospital, and as that thought entered his mind, their suffering began to seep into him. Usually, it didn't take any conscious thought to bring the emotions in. They were always there, always flooding him, and he always had to push them back. Why this time was any different, he didn't know. She was moved this morning, the clerk finally told Joe, as she pulled one piece of paper from the stack and looked it over. She's on the 3rd floor now, room 327. Thank you, Joe smiled, and he pushed off of her desk as he began to walk down the hall toward the stairs. As he went, his thoughts went back to Annalise, trying to figure out what he wanted to ask or say, but he had no idea. He wasn't used to asking the right questions in order to get the information he needed. He was used to things happening around him while he watched. He wanted to ask her about her sister. He wanted to listen to what she had to say and try to understand the circumstances surrounding her sister's disappearance. Maybe ask about the boyfriend and what kind of temper he had. He was beginning to wish that he had a pad to write all these questions down in. Joe opened the door to the stairway and began to climb the stairs toward the 3rd floor, running through his plan in his head. Part of him wished that Michael was there with him, so he could ask the questions and Joe could sit back and observe. But he wasn't so lucky. He would need to figure this out on his own. When he reached the 3rd floor and stepped into the hallway, Joe was so focused on what he was going to do and what he was going to say that he didn't notice the man standing by the elevator doors. "Joe Oster," the man said, catching Joe's attention. As Joe looked up, his focus was dropped, and a wave of intrigue came over him as he saw Roy's face. Roy smiled. He was obviously interested in why Joe was at the hospital, but there was a cocky playfulness to that attitude. He was amused when Joe noticed him. "I don't have time for interviews," Joe told him, trying to press on toward Annalise's room. Roy hurried to keep up with Joe. As they walked, Roy said, "She's asleep, doped up and out like a light. I can wait." "For what? What is this about, Joe? Why was this woman outside of your store?" Joe didn't answer. He just kept walking, trying to ignore Roy and not allow any hint of his mission to show on his face. Roy stepped in front of Joe and stopped him from walking any farther. If Joe didn't know any better, he could have sworn that there was a sense of regret in the reporter. "Listen, I think we got off on the wrong foot," Roy told him. "I didn't know that you'd have any problem with what I wrote. Mary never made it out to be a secret. I don't see why there should be any bad feelings between us." Joe looked Roy in the eyes, trying to tell whether he was being sincere or just manipulating Joe. There was that sense of regret, which suggested that he might be telling the truth. But Joe also felt the excitement that Roy had for his work. He loved the thrill of the hunt. He loved seeking answers. He was the opposite of Joe in that respect, and if Joe wasn't careful, he would tip off the press about Annalise's sister before he had time to understand the situation himself. "There's no ill will here," Joe assured Roy. "Good," Roy smiled. "I'm glad. So, now that we've settled that..." Roy turned and started to walk toward Annalise's room once again. Joe walked beside him. "Look, I know you think there's a story here, but you're wrong. It's just a poor girl who stepped out into the street without looking both ways first. There's nothing more to see." "I don't believe that," Roy said. "I have a sense for these things. Call it my own psychic power. I know there's a story here, and I think that if we work together, we can figure out what that story is." Joe stopped walking again and grabbed Roy's arm. He wanted to tell him to get out and leave him alone. He wanted to tell him to stop trying to find stories in other people's pain. He wanted to say a lot of things, but he didn't allow those words to come out. What he said instead was, "Give me your card and leave Miss Meyer alone. I'll call you if I have any premonitions." "I'm staying right here until I get to talk to her," Roy told Joe, looking him straight in the eye and never wavering. Joe didn't respond. He simply began to walk once again, counting room numbers as he went along. Roy was close behind him. As he walked, Joe saw the nurse's station just down the hallway. He went to it and placed his hands on the counter, waiting patiently for the nurse sitting closest to him to get off the phone. Roy was right beside him. Joe looked over to him and gave him a polite smile. The nurse was a woman in her 40s, with dark hair just showing the first signs of gray. She wore little makeup, and her nails looked chewed on, which Joe saw as she held up a finger, asking him to wait a moment. She seemed pleasant enough. She felt the same way as anyone would if they had a nurse's job, tired, stressed. But she also took pride in her work. She enjoyed it, or perhaps she enjoyed the fact that she made a difference in the world. Joe couldn't tell exactly where that joy came from, but he thought about it as he waited. Once the nurse was off the phone, she looked at Joe and said, "I'm sorry to make you wait. Is there something you need?" "I'm looking for room 327, Joe told her. "I'm a friend of Annalise Meyer." The nurse nodded and pointed down the hallway. "Just that way, about 4 doors down on the left." Joe nodded his thanks and began to walk off, before stopping himself and turning back to the nurse. In a matter-of-fact tone, he told her, "This man beside me is a reporter looking to harass Miss Meyer." The nurse nodded. "I'll call security." Joe nodded another thanks and turned toward Annalise's room. He gave Roy a quick nod goodbye as he started walking. Roy walked with him. "I never pegged you for a rat, Oster," Roy commented. "You don't know anything about me," Joe replied. "But that never stopped you from writing your story, did it?" "I have as much right to see her as you do." "She wanted to see me. That's the difference." "How do you know she wouldn't want to see me? She might like some publicity for her sister's story. Maybe a line or two about the police refusing to help her. We could have her sister found within a week." Joe shrugged and opened the door to Annalise's room. He saw her lying in bed, staring out the window. She had a bandage on her head and blankets pulled up to her neck. She seemed tired. "I've reconsidered," Joe told her. "I'm going to help you." Annalise turned toward him and blinked a couple of times, as though trying to remember who he was. When she remembered, she put on a faint smile and said, "Joe, come in. Who's your friend?" "He's no friend of mine. He's a reporter who wants to splash your name all over the rags." Annalise put a hand over her face and shook her head as she said, No, get rid of him, would you?" "Sure thing," Joe told her. He turned toward Roy and shrugged, just as a security guard approached. Roy looked at Joe, feeling no love at all for him, and then turned his attention toward the security guard. As he turned and walked down the hallway once again, Roy said to Joe, "I'll see you around." Joe nodded and said, "That tends to happen when you're following someone." Joe walked farther into Annalise's room and closed the door behind him. He walked to the side of her bed and stood over her, looking down. Her eyes were glassy. Her hair was a mess. She looked nothing like the woman who had come to him in his store. Instead of that angry, frustrating woman that he had spoken to, he was now standing in front of a victim. He couldn't help but feel sorry for her. The fact that she was medicated made it difficult for him to get a read on what she was feeling as she sat in that hospital room. He couldn't tell if she was in pain or sad. He couldn't tell if she was angry for having been run over. She seemed like a blur to him, just barely awake. "How are you feeling?" he asked her. It was not a question that he used often. "I'm feeling positively splendid," she told him. "How else would I feel after being hit by a car?" "I hear you have some broken ribs." "Bruised, and a bruised head, and a bruised leg," she muttered, her eyes closing midway through that last sentence. She opened them again and said, "Whoever hit me didn't do a very good job of it." "Are you in pain?" "Only when I breathe," she smiled. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment with her half-closed eyes and narrowed them even more as she asked, "Did you hit me?" "No." "Of course you didn't." "That's right. I saw you running up the sidewalk. Why were you running?" "I'm not entirely sure." "Did you know that I was going to be hit?" "No. I've told you before I'm not psychic." Even as he said that, he had to wonder why he had been running toward his store. What caused that feeling of terror? What caused him to run? He didn't believe he was psychic, but even he wouldn't have bought that answer if he were Annalise. Luckily, she was doped up and not thinking clearly. She wasn't as abrasive as she had been. "Who hit me?" she asked, suddenly getting some of that harshness back in her voice. The question sounded cold and bitter. "I don't know. I didn't see the driver, and I don't know who the car belongs to. I was hoping that you would." "I didn't see it. I was a little preoccupied at the time." "It was a Ford, maybe a couple of years old. Green. Do you know it?" "I live in a city, Mr. Oster. I've seen thousands of cars that fit that description." "Of course," he nodded. "Do you know anyone who might want to hurt you?" She looked at him as though it was the stupidest question in the world, and said, "The man who took my sister." Joe nodded. He looked behind him and saw a small chair, which he pulled close to the bed so that he could sit down. He took out a cigarette and lit it. He would have offered one to Annalise, but she didn't seem up to it. He took a deep drag from his cigarette and considered his next question. Finally, he decided to go with what little information he had. He said, "People say that your sister got married and left town." Annalise nodded and looked up at the ceiling as she replied, "You've been asking people questions." "Only one, really. Your priest." "I don't make it to church very often," he told me. "I suppose he thinks I'm crazy too." "He didn't say that." "Do you think I'm crazy, Mr. Oster? Do you think that all of this is in my head?" "I honestly don't know what I think anymore. All I do know is that someone was after either you or me, if not the both of us. I figure if I don't help you now, we're both likely to end up spread across the street, and next time it happens, we won't be as lucky as the last time." "I don't feel lucky." Images of his wife and daughter flashed through Joe's head. A siren could be heard outside the window, and Joe could practically smell the rain from the night they died. He closed his eyes and forced those images out of his head. "Trust me," he said. "It could have been worse." She closed her eyes and adjusted her head a little bit before asking, "What happens next?" Joe looked down to his cigarette and watched the smoke coming off of its tip, rising into the air in swirls and finally dissolving as it neared the ceiling. "I'm not sure," he told her. "I don't normally do this sort of thing. I suppose we try to figure out what happened to your sister. We ask questions. We look through her things." "I've done it all 100 times, she told him, sounding just barely awake now. "Then you can walk me through it." He waited for her to respond, but the room was silent. When he looked at her, he saw that she was asleep. He couldn't help but think that when she awoke, she was likely to be more like the arrogant woman that he'd first encountered in the bookstore, and he wondered just how long the doctors planned to keep her medicated. He smiled at the thought as he leaned back in the chair and put his feet up on her bed. He smoked his cigarette and looked out the window. The world was going on just beyond that pane of glass. People were hurting and dying. Whoever was following him and had run over Annalise was out there, maybe even nearby. But for just that moment, he didn't have anywhere else to be. He knew that it was just a matter of time before the world came crashing down around him, so he took that quiet time in the hospital room, and he savored it for as long as he could. Roy could have been called a lot of things, and he could deny very few of them. The one thing that nobody could ever accuse him of was hating his job. He enjoyed the thrill of the hunt as he tracked down leads and questioned sources. He liked the finality when it all came together and he finally released his story to the world. After a story was released, there was a lull. It was in that in-between area when he wasn't sure what the next story would be. Some part of him always wondered if there would be another story at all. Sure, the world would continue to go on, and people would continue to be ugly toward one another, but when he couldn't see the next headline around the corner, he could hear a tiny voice inside of him, wondering if he'd seen his last bit of glory. Then blood would be spilled. Someone would scream in the night. The police would be called and Roy would be on his way to the next crime scene. His blood would be pumping through his veins like at no other time in his life. He didn't enjoy the fact that people were dying. He just didn't think about that fact much at all. To him, it was information that the world needed to know. Sure, the mourning family was a good angle to play, but it wasn't about them. It was about documenting a moment in time so the world would never forget it. It was about being there and witnessing that moment. It was about experiencing the world and being able to prove that he existed once the lights went out and he was gone. The newspaper was a magical thing. It was H.G. Wells's Time Machine and an Emily Dickinson poem printed daily and delivered to 10,000 doorsteps. Birth announcements and obituaries printed on the same page. Comics for children to read and baseball scores for their fathers. Department store specials and stock market reports. The newspaper was a photograph of life, but in far more detail than any picture could ever capture. Where else could you get a picture of Russia's political awakening and America's economic downfall? To say that he loved the news would be an understatement. He lived and breathed the news because it was eternal. People would read it and debate it for centuries to come, and he wanted to be sitting on their tables when they did it. His name, his perspective, his thoughts and words. He existed. He was real, and he could prove it to anyone who dared to challenge that idea. That's the thing that Joe Oster didn't seem to understand. He saw Roy as an opportunistic wretch, but Roy saw things differently. He thought that he and Joe Oster had a lot in common. They could both truly see the world in front of them. Roy and Joe could have done great things together, with Roy's ability to find answers and Joe's ability to see what was to come. It was a chance for Roy to not just write the news, but to make the news. He could not only document the world, he could change it. Of course, he wouldn't do anything too grand. He had to remain impartial as a journalist, but to follow a story like the missing Meyer girl would be the chance of a lifetime. She'd been gone for a year. The trail was cold and nobody was even looking for her. No newspaper was reporting her story. Nobody would ever know that she had existed or that she had died unless Roy got in on the story. Through him, she could become immortal, even if she was face down in a ditch somewhere. After leaving the hospital at the request of a rather large and intimidating security guard, Roy stepped onto the sidewalk and looked at the world before him. What he saw was a world of possibility. Each person was a story waiting to be told. Even if Joe wasn't in the mood to deal with him now, Roy could continue his work and dig for answers. If he could find something on this Meyer woman, maybe Oster would see that his goal wasn't as malicious as everyone seemed to think. Maybe Mary would stop looking at him like he had the plague. Just thinking about her put a smile on his face. The spirit she had in her, the fire. It was the same thirst for life that he felt. He could tell that she wanted to see the world, if only she could figure out how. He walked down the sidewalk with a hop in his step, picturing all of the different avenues that he could pursue. The sister wasn't Leah Meyer's only connection to the world. She couldn't be. There had to be other family or friends. He could start by going to her neighborhood and asking everyone he saw if they knew her. Even if it was in passing, they might hold a vital piece of the puzzle that would bring the story into context. The game was afoot, and Roy Mitchell was a man who loved to play. The moment Sam Dandridge walked into the Capitol and saw Mary, he knew that something in his life had changed for good. He remembered stories that his aunt used to tell him when he was a little boy about how she met his uncle. She said that the moment their eyes met, it was as though they had known each other all along. They were a part of each other. It was a far cry from the story that his mother told about how she met his father. That story involved her parents pressuring her to get married before she was too old to attract a husband. She settled for an older man whose first wife was dead, and she took on the task of raising his 3 children, all of whom hated her. Sam's siblings didn't include him in their games. They didn't whisper their secrets to him. His family was his mother, his father until his death, and his aunts, uncles, and cousins, all on his mother's side. He was fine with that arrangement. His cousin, Harvey Jenkins, was just about Sam's age. They grew up in New Jersey, playing together like brothers as children and conspiring like brothers as teenagers. They didn't split up until Sam joined the Navy. Even after that, Harvey took a job at Sam's base, performing a variety of tasks, such as securing the lines of airships as they landed. That was Sam's family. It wasn't about the normal sibling bond, it was about something greater. It was about finding someone who filled a hole in Sam's life. Mary filled another hole inside of him. It was a hole that he didn't even know existed until he was dragged to a bar by his pal Sid and saw her there. Suddenly, everything that his aunt had told him made sense. He thought he was crazy. He didn't know this girl. He'd never spoken a word to her. In fact, he found himself tongue-tied every time she came around, making it that much harder for him to understand the connection. He thought he was a fool with a silly infatuation, a schoolboy crush. It couldn't have been real. He told that to himself over and over again, trying to convince himself that it was the truth. He nearly succeeded too, after he saw her fighting with a man on the street and he stepped in to make sure that she was safe. That night, she walked away from him without a second thought, and he was certain that it was all done with. If they were meant to be, surely she would have felt something as well. But she didn't. He went on with his life and didn't plan on going back to the bar again. He was going to put that girl out of his mind and move on. And then he heard her call to him on the street that day as he passed by her bookstore. Even when he was determined to put her out of his mind, she found a way back into his life. They spent the day together, playing cards and talking about their lives. She grew up in the city. He grew up in the mountains. She had a sister that she adored. He barely spoke to his siblings. She was bold and energetic, and he was broken. He didn't tell her everything that day. He didn't want to ruin the fun that they were having by telling her about his cousin and what happened. He didn't want to tell her about how he'd been kicked out of the Navy, and he especially didn't want to tell her why. Sam enjoyed that day as he hadn't enjoyed himself in a long time. He didn't want it to end. Even after the store was closed, the two of them went out for a bite to eat and they continued to talk. There were so many things that made them completely different from one another, yet when they put their busted-up lives together, it seemed to make a whole. He didn't have the nerve to ask her if she felt the same way. She had told him in the bar that she had a boyfriend, and Sam could only assume that the man that he had pinned up against the wall that night was that boyfriend. But she didn't say anything about him when they talked. She smiled and looked at him in a way that made him feel like the only man in the world. He didn't dare try to kiss her, because he didn't want to risk bursting that bubble. He wanted to live in that fantasy for as long as she would allow him to. That night, Sam walked into the small apartment that he shared with Sid. He found Sid sitting alone, eating an apple and listening to the radio. Sam dropped his keys on the kitchen counter and went to the sink for a glass of water. The whole time, he could feel Sid's eyes on him. When he turned and faced Sid, his roommate had a grin on his face. "You're home late," Sid said, chewing on his apple. "I was with a friend." "I'm the only friend that you have in this town." "I was with a new friend." "A friend with long hair and pouty lips?" Sam didn't want to answer. He hated talking about women with Sid. The two of them couldn't have been more different when it came to dating. Sid was a playboy who would date a different girl every night of the week if he had the opportunity. Sam was more interested in finding the woman that he would marry. Usually, when Sid pressured Sam for details, it made Sam uncomfortable. He didn't want to be mocked or laughed at. He didn't want another lecture on how to get out there and meet women. This time, things were different. When Sid asked about Sam's new friend, Sam couldn't keep a silly grin from forming on his face. Sid stood up, looking absolutely shocked as he said, "You did it. You actually did it. You talked to a woman, didn't you?" Sam nodded and took a seat on a wobbly old wooden chair that they'd found in an alley and brought home so that one of them wouldn't have to sit on the floor anymore. The chair was only a slight step up in Sam's opinion. "Who is she?" Sid asked. "What's her name? What's she like? What are her measurements?" "Her name is Mary. She's the waitress from that bar." "You're pulling my leg. You're not seriously telling me that you worked up the nerve to talk to that girl." "She talked to me." "Why?" Sid asked, seeming genuinely shocked and mildly disgusted. "No offense or nothing." "Why would I take offense at that?" Sam asked. As the night went on, Sam told Sid all about his day with Mary and their plans to see a movie the next night. Sid made fun of Sam. They laughed and joked, and until he was ready to turn in for the night, Sam didn't realize that he had managed to spend most of his day without thinking about how far he had fallen in life. For the first time in a long time, he felt as though he was moving upward. The future looked bright. As he prepared to turn in for the night, Sam emptied his pockets just as he did every night. He put his wallet on the table near the front door so he wouldn't forget it on his way to work. He put his cigarettes on the nightstand next to his bed. And just when he thought he was done, he found his keys in his left-hand pocket and put them on the kitchen counter, where he could have sworn he'd put them earlier.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories